It's a pleasure to be here, and also a pleasure to have been forced to read the book, which was very well worth it. And I congratulate Janine and all the authors and colleagues for putting it together. I think it's a very comprehensive, it's a very ambitious, and I think it has some quite bold conclusions and messages. I think, the key issue that I really focused on in reading it was the issue around institutions. And I think, the key message really is that greater equity and social justice can be achieved as an outcome of certain sets of institutions which are amenable to policy choices. And so then what constitutes the institutions that can lead to those social justice outcomes that can also be productive, dynamic, economically productive, with productive citizens, a good labour force, and that create good jobs. And I think it focuses on the two sets of institutions, which sometimes are combined, and I think I'll come back to this point, but the labour market institutions and social security institutions or social policies, and really looks in great detail at different particular sets of policies in terms of what works and how and the impacts. And I think it also focuses nicely on what we're looking at also at UNRISD in terms of social policy, on what we're terming institutional complementarities or synergies, but the interactions between them, as you mentioned. And I think thirdly, it brings out, not so explicitly and not so consistently, but it's there, things about the social and power relationships that really, and the politics that actually underlie things. And I think that could come out a bit more. I'll come back to that. But I think it sort of is making the case that institutions matter for development and matter for economies, and that they're important in both creating inequalities, but certainly in overcoming inequalities. So at a general level, I think, Sun started by saying that in 2012, when it started, inequality wasn't a major issue on the agenda. Of course, UNRISD had published in 2010 the report, which is very much, no, I'm not looking at that, which is very much referred to, actually. It's very nice to see it referred to. But I think some of the higher level messages are very similar to the kind of messages we said then at a higher level. But then what this really contributes, and I think is really a valuable contribution from my perspective, is really building up the evidence for how and why certain standard or relatively widespread institutions like minimum wages, like collective bargaining that we've heard about, work particularly in some contexts and particularly in more developed contexts. And in LDCs, the focus tends to be more on the social protection mechanisms. And I think that in itself is something that I'll come back to. The difference globally, I mean, it's very ambitious in trying to be comprehensive globally in its coverage, but then I think it raises questions about what works when, why in different contexts. I think another reason it's important is that there's a high bar, and you've sort of implicitly mentioned this in your opening comment, on sort of producing evidence that makes a case for normative or social justice issues. You have to have much stronger evidence, in a sense. It's seen as inherently ideological, whereas, the idea that perfectly competitive, apolitical, neutral markets, as one of the chapters discusses, is sort of somehow not ideological. And I think you've sort of gone a long way towards providing the evidence that we can make those normative arguments around. So I think that's a really important contribution. There's a lot of detail, and I'm not going to comment on all the detail of all the chapters. What I just want to make is build on three areas, which are probably more about things that I would like to see and that I think could be future developments that, I would be excited about anyway. One is really about the nature of institutions, going in a little bit more detail, and particularly the relationship between the labour market institutions and the social policy institutions, and problematizing that a bit more and understanding the connections, because I think that's one thing that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, that connection in the context of deflationary macroeconomic reforms and austerity and all of these kinds of policies has weakened the link. And in a sense, what we're saying is that these need to be reconnected and rebuilt. But there are obviously different debates about doing that. And you've got people who argue for decommodification of labor through basic income grants and citizenship-based things, which may also be important. We've done a bit of work trying to explore some of these, how these articulate and what the relationship is. And really concluding, I think, which would be consistent probably with what you're saying, that these more citizen-based provisions, including universal policy, social provisions, that is in the chapter by Franco Juliana, go further than targeted approaches in meeting needs and freeing from conditionalities, but they need to complement rather than sort of be separate from employment policies. But I think that would be an interesting thing, I think, to explore further, rather than sort of subsuming them together, but coming at them from separate angles and seeing where they overlap and how. I think the second key issue, which is there strongly in the book, and I commend it, is the whole set of issues around gender care and social reproduction. And I think this gets back also to the nature of institutions and the nature of markets as socially embedded institutions. And of course, the gender literature is the one that's probably developed this most strongly, that these do not operate in a sort of social vacuum, but they're products of the way in which society is structured. And social relations, gender relations, are probably the easiest way to see that. And I think the strength of the volume is that gender's not just reduced to the problem of women and women, the outcomes for women. So it's quite strong throughout the book. And I think the chapter by Sarah Gamage shows both the wider domestic sphere, the care economy, and the ways in which labour markets and the institutions' wage setting are gendered. So both dimensions, the outside and inside the labour market. I think there's in the introductory overview chapter, you tend to conclude, I think, that the issue, the weaker labour force attachment, is primarily driven by the unequal care responsibilities. And I think that's a really important thing. It's good to see it being brought in, but I don't think we can neglect the discrimination and the labour market and the fact that the institutions of labour are themselves gendered. And so, it would be interesting, I think, to really follow through all of these by seeing gender as a way to structure the whole analysis, rather than seeing gender as something where you focus on outcomes for women, because that's not a group. They're divided equally by class, race, and every other characteristic. But all of the institutions are equally gendered because they're within a socially constructed structure. I think the one other point about the discussion, implied in the discussion of gender and care issues, but less explicit, is also linked to the labour markets, that labour is a produced commodity, and it's produced by the labour that is unpaid in the care economy. And I think that connection is the one that maybe doesn't come out explicitly, but could be an important issue in linking these different spheres. And my third, what am I doing for time? Point, I'll be quick. It gets back to the issue of this global scope, which again I think is ambitious and commendable, and it means that there's sort of something for everybody. Learning about the impact of part-time work or zero-hour contracts in my country. There's a huge amount of detail and things in there, and you conclude, as we all conclude these days, that no one size fits all, and policies need to be designed to reflect specific conditions. But I think then we don't really know to what extent, as the analysis of countries is really largely by income and how developed they are in terms of GDP per capita, what the relationship between these different institutional arrangements and the level of development and income is. And I think that just going back to the UNRWA's report, the approach we took in that project, which was led by my predecessor, Tandika, was trying to identify sort of what he termed policy regimes and looking at pathways to structural transformation and the different kind of nature of the economy and options for structural transformation. And I think implicitly this book, by the way it's structured, seems to assume a manufacturing labour-intensive path of structural transformation, that countries can go through that path. And the question now is, can they? And what are the alternatives? And what does that mean for these kind of labour institutions in lower income countries that are now trying to face a process of structural transformation? And if it's not going to be, if you've got weak national capital because it's all FDI-led and can move very quickly, if the attachment to these labour standards, etc., is weaker, if because of high levels of informality, then you don't have the tax systems, or if government revenues are coming from extractive industries where there's less link to the power of labour, unlimited opportunities for organising and collective bargaining, and all of those things, then what does that mean for the development of these kind of labour market institutions at different stages of development? And obviously there are examples. There's the kind of organising that you see with SEWA and HomeNet and those kind of examples. There's alternatives in terms of the social solidarity economy types of organising. But these are different kinds of politics and power relationships around labour in the contemporary world, which is very different from when all of these institutions were developed. And it would be nice in the future to see, something that really tried to grapple with what this means in the contemporary context. So I'll finish there.